Recording in progress for anyone who didn't hear that one. All right, so tonight we are going to have a look at 5 example questions that I have written that, in my opinion, are similar in style and substance to NPE questions. For anyone who doesn't know, my name is Jasmine Kelly. I will be tonight's lead learner, and I use she, her pronouns. Obviously, some very shameful self-promotion. I'm still learning how to kind of do this part of the job, but tonight is absolutely free. But there is, if you like what you see, if you think it's interesting, and you want to learn more, I have a website and my NPE course, which I'm kind of jokingly referring to as a crash course, because it's designed to be quick. It's 10 hours of videos covering 5 different topics, explanations, questions, and lots of resources to share. It is really designed with the average provisional psychologist in mind. I'm not assuming that you have a ton of pre-existing knowledge. I'm not assuming that you have a ton of extra time. And I'm guessing that you're going to be, like most people, spending approximately 3 months preparing for the exam. And I have a suggested method of studying that's evidence-based. My background is in education, so that you're doing really high quality, effective study with your time. And you're kind of essentially getting this done as quickly as you can, and that way you can pass the exam the first time around. So I know we meet from all different places today, and in acknowledgement of country, is in the spirit of reconciliation, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. So for anyone who isn't aware, I'm a psychologist, a supervisor. I gained my registration through the 5+1 program, and I'm a graduate of USQ. I did my first 4 years at the University of Queensland before going and joining their 5th-year program. And I passed the exam in 2015, which makes me kind of, not like the earliest, but close to one of the earliest, kind of cohorts to be required to sit this exam. And there actually really aren't that many supervisors I've found that have sat the exam. It's more and more every year, obviously, as kind of that cohort ages into being able to be registered as a supervisor and are interested in being registered as a supervisor. But when I sat the exam, nobody knew what the hell was going on. My supervisor had no clue on how to start, on where to help, and it was really hard because we just had to figure it out on our own. And I'm really grateful that we now have a whole community around the NPE to make this journey that little bit easier, and to help people feel a little bit more supported. So the hardest part, in my opinion, about the NPE is applying your knowledge to the questions. I come across this all the time. People who know the facts, who know the information that that you need to, who have read the reading list, and they don't realize that, they don't realize what the question is about. They don't see how they can apply their knowledge to the question and be able to, kind of choose the best answer. And that's really what my course is designed to do. It's not as heavy on like lots of facts and information, like let's go deep diving on every single reading list item. It is a more broad perspective, but it's designed to help you know how to actually apply this knowledge to these questions. A lot of the questions are trying to trick you. They are designed to be difficult, and they're designed to try and, elicit stereotypical responses that sometimes those responses are correct in our actual work. But when you're looking at the NPE questions, they are going to trip you up. So thinking about real life examples or, situations you've been in is probably going to lead you down the wrong path a lot of the time. And at its core, in my opinion, and the opinion of many people, this is an ethics test. The ethics section is asking you to show ethical best practice, but the assessment section is asking you to demonstrate ethical best practice whilst doing assessment. The intervention section is asking you to show ethical best practice while engaging in intervention. And the communication section, oh, obviously that's a terrible term. Essentially, communication, I think a better term for it would be diversity. It would be looking at how do you appropriately consider the client's diversity when approaching a situation, which is tricky because sometimes that means a person is a person and they deserve the same high standard of care as everyone else. And other times a client absolutely needs a different approach because of their diversity, and treating them the same as everyone else is another form of discrimination. So, that's a really fun one. And I know communication looks like a really small section because it only represents 10% of the questions that you'll be asked, but I have seen a lot of people who have failed the exam be really harmed by their low score in communication. So it's not to be overlooked. So, question time. I know some people hate it when I read the questions, they prefer to just read them, but I'm going to read them out loud because they also do have some supervisees who have vision impairment, and so they can't read the questions. If you don't like listening, just mute. You work in a company providing intervention to clients through an employee assistance program. You call a potential new client, Lisa, 30-year-old female, after she self-referred regarding her social anxiety. The client expresses she has been meaning to call but has been too worried that you will disclose her information to her boss, and this will negatively impact her chances of promotion. What is the most important next step? 1. Clarify that the client's right to confidentiality and privacy would prevent you from disclosing any information to Lisa's employer. 2. Reassure the client that this concern is a normal symptom of social anxiety, but there is no reason for this fear. 3. Clarify your company's limited confidentiality policy and explain the relationship between parties so the client can make an informed decision. 4. Explain that you are required to share all information with Lisa's boss. Or 5. Advise the client that she should seek support from a psychologist outside of the EAP. For everyone who's joining with me live, if you would like to, you don't have to, you can pop your answer in the chat, putting the number 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. It's always a little bit fun to kind of play along at home. If you prefer, just write it down on a piece of paper. Hopefully this first question isn't too tricky. I've learned that if I make the first ones hard, people tend to not like it and get a little upset with me. All right, I'm seeing some 3s, and yes, that is the correct answer. So even though our answer here, 1, clarify the client's right to confidentiality and privacy, this is true. They do have rights to confidentiality and privacy. And if we look at the APS Code of Ethics, we would be inclined to just go down this path. But if we take into consideration the context of this question, the employee assistance program, we'll be aware that in reality, every company and every EAP has a slightly different arrangement, has a slightly different confidentiality policy that will vary how much information is and is not shared with the employer. And it's really important that the client can make an informed decision before they decide to engage with the service. So 3 is our best answer. Question 2. Michael, 35-year-old male, is referred for an assessment to determine if he is ready to return to work. The client is a police officer and has been on leave for the last 18 months due to work-related stress. Michael reports that he is fine and needs to return to work as soon as possible due to financial hardship. You administer the K10 and the client's score is 35. What is the next appropriate step? 1. Conduct further assessment to determine Michael's suitability to return to work. 2. Write a report for the client's employer confirming the client is fit to return to work. 3. Tell the client that he is not ready to return to work. 4. The K10 results indicate Michael is likely to have a severe mental disorder. Or 5. Conduct a risk assessment. Yet again, pop answers in the chat if you like. One. I often we should put an answer 6. I don't want to choose any of these. It's also occasionally something that people want to pick with the NPE. All right. Our answer is 5. Conduct a risk assessment. So for anyone who is familiar with the K10, you'll know that a score of 35 is pretty high. It's pretty high. The maximum is 50, and 35 would absolutely put you in this severe range. So 4 is an example of an answer that is true. This is true, but it doesn't meet our little question. So this is the overall question. This is the vignette, the little story, and this is what I call the little question. So what is the next appropriate step? Sometimes this will say, what should you not do? What is the most, important factor? That, there's all different variations. And to be honest, usually it's something like, what is the next appropriate step, but not always. And even though 4 is true, it doesn't answer our little question. With the K10, they would have asked questions regarding depression, I'm feeling anxious, and with the score of 35, it's pretty likely that Michael's answers would have indicated that he is potentially at risk of harm to himself or having suicidal ideation. And even though number 1 represents what we should do in line with our referral question, as risk and Michael's safety are a more important priority, our next appropriate step is to conduct a risk assessment for Michael before looking at, what else we should do, whether that is continue the assessment, making a referral, whatever is appropriate, depending on how that risk assessment goes, because Michael may be acutely unwell. He may be high risk of suicide or self-harm, and we need to thoroughly risk assess and probably manage that situation first. Does that make sense to everyone who's here? Anyone disagree with me? People often do like to disagree with me, which I do not mind. Okay, cool. Next question. You work in a school and see a new client, Rosie, 16-year-old. Rosie reports that she views her body as huge and obese. She eats 2 crackers and 3 carrots per day and weighs herself obsessively. Rosie reports an intense fear of gaining weight. Rosie reports that the last 6 months, at least once a week, she pigs out, consuming everything in the kitchen, before then trying to get even by inducing vomiting. Rosie reports her BMI is 16.5 and her goal is a BMI of 16. You diagnose Rosie with 1. Bulimia nervosa mild, 2. Bulimia nervosa moderate, 3. Anorexia nervosa mild, 4. Anorexia nervosa moderate, or 5. Binge eating disorder. I told you there was going to be spelling mistakes somewhere because all these questions are new. It says he, not her, I know. And it says, 16 years old instead of 16-year-old. So same as the previous questions. Pop your answers in the chat if you have one. The 6th answer probably would be, I haven't actually read the diagnostic criteria of the DSM, so I don't know. This is a really hard one because 2 factors. Firstly, I haven't given you everything. I haven't actually given you enough to fully diagnose Rosie with an eating disorder. If anyone happened to be a savant and know all the eating disorder criteria, or if you're watching a recording, you paused and gone and looked, there is definitely criteria that's missing from from here. This isn't a perfect presentation, but you'll find that happens a lot in the NPE. Most of the time, the DSM criteria is so extensive that if you actually were to write a little vignette that would cover everything, it would take up it would take up twice as much room, and there just isn't time for that. One thing we've noticed with the NPE over the last even last 3 or 4 months, this like the last round of exams, the questions have gotten shorter. And I've heard from people who have sat the exam multiple times, and they said that even they've noticed the exam's gotten shorter. So this is going to happen a lot, that you just have to pick the one that's best, the one that's closest. And in this case, and obviously this is my opinion, the answer is moderate, as anorexia nervosa. The reason this is a really common misconception is because of the binging. A lot of people think, and this is largely from media, you think skinny girl, let's face it, most of the time it's girls when we're talking about eating disorders. And I think, boys are really underrepresented and probably do have eating disorders if they just don't meet the specific diagnostic criteria, but that is an argument for another day. When we hear anorexia, we think skinny girl who doesn't eat anything. And we hear bulimia, we think skinny girl who throws up. And if you look at the DSM diagnostic criteria, which in my content I absolutely do, you will see that there's actually a subtype of anorexia nervosa that is called the binge purging subtype. So there's 2 subtypes of anorexia. One is the restricting and the other one is the binging. And in the bulimia criteria, it also has a thing that states that the the binge purging behavior is not occurring within a bout of anorexia. So the thing that makes this anorexia is the caloric restriction, leading to low body weight. So off the top of my head, I think a healthy body weight is like 19 or higher. I'm pretty sure that the mild category would be a BMI of 17 or above, moderate is 16 or above, severe is 15 or above, and extreme is below 15. Now that I've said those out loud, I'm probably going to be wrong, but I'm fairly certain that's what it is. And so that is why Rosie would be anorexia nervosa, binge purge subtype with the rating of moderate due to her BMI. Does that make sense to everybody? Anyone want to ask any questions or, disagree with me? Because diagnosis is a tricky area. There's a lot of nuance here, and I certainly have gotten things wrong before, in my work, in my understanding of concepts. There's just so much in the DSM. It's really difficult to keep it all straight, which is another problem I have with the NPE. You don't need to in real life. In real life, if Rosie came into my office and I wanted to know this, I would open up the book and look. I would figure it out. There's no points for memorizing all of this. And I actually think we shouldn't be kind of encouraging psychs to try and memorize all of this, because I think that's going to lead to mistakes. It makes you feel like you're supposed to be able to work day to day with this all in your memory. And I just don't think that's realistic. And I don't think it's helpful to us or to clients. Question 4. An 8-year-old client was referred by their school principal for assessment. The principal reported the student refuses to complete schoolwork and seems to be off with the fairies. The student is Aboriginal and English is not spoken at home. The principal has asked you to complete a WISC. What is the most appropriate response? 1. Don't administer the WISC because the principal can't dictate what assessment measures you use. 2. Administer the WISC as you have an ethical obligation to provide the same standard of practice to all clients. 3. Administer the WISC after the client's hearing and vision have been checked. 4. Administer the WISC after conducting further intake and a classroom observation. Or 5. Administer the WIAT and the WISC to gather information about cognitive ability and achievement. Pop your answer in the chat if you're feeling brave. Hey. All right, I'm seeing some ones. Yes, it is the one. Now, this is a great example of how something can be the best answer available to you, even if you don't really agree with it. I like the first part, don't administer the WISC, but the reason is because the principal you shouldn't be dictating to you. That's not the reason, but it's the only answer where you don't administer the WISC. Anyone who's here live, can anyone tell me why 1 is the correct answer, why we shouldn't be administering a WISC to this client? Language barrier. Yes, that's correct. So there's 2 factors here. The first is culture. So the WISC 5 is not culturally rated for use with First Nations children. Unfortunately, there really isn't a cognitive measure that is definitely approved and validated for use in First Nations children. There are some cognitive tests that are designed to not have cultural influence, and so theoretically can be used with anyone from any cultural background. But as far as I'm aware, I'm thinking of the unit if anyone's interested, and I'm just not sure off the top of my head if it actually has been approved and like kind of sanctioned for use with First Nations kids. I'm pretty sure it doesn't, because I saw a talk by Tracy Westerman, and she kind of pointed out the hypocrisy of putting cultural competence onto the NPE and having it be a competence that you need to have to know to only use measures that are culturally rated for First Nations people. But then also, when you look at the measures that are on the NPE assessment list, none of them are rated for use with Aboriginal populations. So, she pointed out how it's very like, this is the standard you should be held to, but we're not going to hold ourselves to that standard because we're not going to actually put the time and effort into putting the assessment measures that are culturally rated into the curriculum, and therefore reinforce you all becoming more familiar with using them. So, good point, Tracy. Question 5, so this is the last one available to everyone who was on the recording. Everyone who came live gets the bonus question after the fact. So question 5, you're working with a client, Sandy, 8 years old, for the treatment of separation anxiety. You find the mother is inadvertently reinforcing Sandy's behavior, but you see significant improvement after 12 sessions. Sandy's mother identifies that Sandy's younger sister, Rachel, 6 years old, is showing the same behavior during separation. The next step should be 1, begin intervention with the mother as she is clearly the cause of both girls' separation anxiety. 2, conclude your intervention with Sandy and commence treatment of Rachel. 3, see each girl separately. You have thorough insight into the family/history to best inform intervention for both clients. 4, advise the parents to acquire a mental health care plan for Rachel, and you will commence intervention after your work with Sandy has concluded in the next few weeks. Or 5, refer Rachel to another psychologist who is also competent in working with separation anxiety. What do we think? Our answer is 5. The reason we're going to refer Rachel out, does anyone who's here live, does anyone want to either say verbally or pop it into the chat? Why should we refer Rachel on instead of... Sorry, Tana, can you say that again?
Conflict of interest.
Conflict of interest, yeah. I would put it under the category of multiple relationship. Yeah, same, same kind of thing, but essentially under the APS Code of Ethics, you have a significant relationship with your client as well as your client's parent. And in this scenario, if we were to see both Sandy and Rachel, we would be having a professional relationship, but we would be having 2 different professional relationships with the parents of the two clients, and that is not allowed under APS Code of Ethics. In my live groups, because, for anyone who wasn't aware, for years, I've run my NPE content as live group supervision. That is always one of the things that people are shocked at. I've actually had like open mouth, like gaping going, what do you mean I can't see 2 kids from the same family? What do you mean I can't see siblings? I do that all the time. And the reality is that you really shouldn't be. Obviously, if you're in the middle of nowhere and there's no other psychologist to be seen and there's risk involved, yes, you make the best decision, even if it does mean breaking the APS Code of Ethics. But a lot of the time it's easier, it's cheaper, NDAS funding, you've already traveled to the home, the OT is seeing both of them, why can't the psych see both of them as well? And it's because it can go pear-shaped very easily, very quickly. And sometimes the APS Code of Ethics represents our internal ethical compass. There are so many things in there that sit really well with how we view the world and how we view best practice. But sometimes the APS Code of Ethics is written in a way that is meant to highlight the things that aren't obvious, the problems that you don't see coming. And I know myself and many other psychs have seen siblings from the same family, sometimes knowing that it's against the rules, sometimes not knowing, and it's gone absolutely fine. But I've also personally experienced it going very pear-shaped, and I've also supervised, someone where it went, from a legal perspective, went extremely pear-shaped. So, trust me, it is not a good idea. It is not in line with the APS Code of Ethics. And if you have any strong thoughts or feelings or questions about that, please get in touch. It's one of my favorite subjects to discuss the APS Code of Ethics and why it is the way it is. So a few little tips and tricks. These are things mostly that have come from the fact that I've had lots of supervisees who have passed the exam in the last round in August. I don't kind of interview people or try and kind of get information out of them afterwards. I think that's a little bit creepy and not really within the spirit of the exam, but I just have a lot of people that I see for principal or secondary. And, after the exam, how was it? They tended to, tell me about what they noticed. The first one is that everyone seems to get questions on like statistics, like what is effect size, and comparing 2 different studies using effect size. So essentially effect size, the higher, the better, closer to 1, the better off you are. But yeah, that's a kind of odd, really basic question that they've thrown in recently, which maybe will pop up again in the next round of the exam, or maybe it'll be a one-hit wonder and we'll never see it again. The next one is questions comparing the WISC or the WIPSI. You should know why you would use one over the other, what the relative advantages and disadvantages are. So given a scenario, you could choose between. The next one is a little bit strange. So the exam talked a few times about employed positions versus contractor obligations. So, the example given, I think, was you're employed by a school. So you're employed and then you work in private practice as a contractor. And that, having those two different roles within the same community created a conflict. Interestingly, I actually already had a question like this in my NPE content. I just didn't say it was about the whole employed versus contractor thing. I just talked about it in terms of school psych versus, private practice. And the reason I wrote the question is because that's my background. I worked in schools for 6 years. I work in private practice now. So it was kind of a question I wrote drawn from, from professional experience, but it was interesting that it then popped up in the exam recently. Next one is returning from non-practicing or extended leave. So I think there was a couple of questions around returning from like maternity leave. And I think essentially what it was getting at is, do you know what is written in the guideline for recency of practice requirements? So every time you renew your provisional and your general registration, theoretically you are affirming that you have met those requirements, and it's testing you actually know what those requirements say. And I would guess a lot of people wouldn't. Which is a topic I will discuss with our live friends here after the recording ends. There are generally, and this is always the case, lots of questions relating to work cover, to EAP, and to schools. That's why those topics featured in my example questions today and will feature heavily in my questions in my course as well. It's because they pop up all the time in the actual NPE. Psychoanalytic based questions, I was also told was there. I wasn't given any examples and I didn't ask, but I think it's really interesting because there's not a lot of psychoanalytic information in the reading list, and technically all questions in the exam must be able to be kind of traced back to something specific in the reading list. So I'm kind of working on this and trying to update my psychoanalytic content to make it a little more comprehensive, because it's been quite a long time since anyone has said that they've had a psychoanalytic question. The next one was agoraphobia. I am 100% certain down to my bones that agoraphobia is not on the curriculum. There is a list of DSM diagnoses that are meant to be, accessible in the exam, and agoraphobia is not there. I've looked, I've asked other people, it's not there, but I know for a fact that the questions have been asked recently on agoraphobia and on diagnosing agoraphobia. I have no idea what that's about. And if I could prove it to APRA without getting other people in trouble for telling me that, I would, because it's not fair. They're not supposed to be able to ask questions in NPE on things that aren't in the curriculum, but they absolutely seem to be. Oh, whoops, I have written the same point twice, obviously, because it came up so many times when I was chatting to people about how they felt about the exam. So yeah, study for it twice. Obviously put it on the exam slides twice as well. The last part of completely shameful self-promotion. If you found tonight interesting and helpful, head to my website, which is down here, and you can have a look at my crash course. You can buy the course kind of in little parts if you only want bits of it, but my suggestion is to buy the whole thing. I think it's better value, and there'll be 5 topics. The first is preparation and strategy. That's all about the underlying theory of the exam, my suggested method for studying, and also something called the 3-question method. That is the method I suggest you use so that every time you look at an NPE question, you can put the answers in an order. How you can differentiate between the 2 or 3 answers that you want to choose so that you can get the best answer every time. Every time, most of the time, 70% of the time. I've done my NPE content with over 200 supervisees, and not every single one of them, but a lot of them I've spoken to after they've sat the exam, and I usually ask them the same 2 questions. The first is there anything that you didn't study that you wished you had? And when they tell me things, I add content to my slides, which is why my content has grown, from 2 hours, the first time I ever ran a group on the NPE, to well over 12 hours if I run it live, because there's always extra question time. And the second question I ask is, what was most useful? And I would say roughly 90% of the time when people answer that question, they say the 3-question method. So that is covered in the strategy. The next topic is ethics, assessment, intervention. I'm about to add a diagnosis section that's going to kind of go kind of as deep as possible with many examples of those diagnostic questions. So that question you saw tonight on eating disorders, that's an example of something that you'll see in the new and upcoming diagnosis section, which I'm hoping to be done in the next month, well in advance of the exam. And the final section is communication, which is an underestimated section, but surprisingly difficult to get right. There's over 60 example questions sprinkled throughout these 5 sections, and I'm adding new stuff all the time. And it's over 10 hours video, but I'd say most people would need to slow that down, because I ask the question, I pause for a second, I let you, kind of give you a chance to hit pause if you want to, and then I share the answer. So that way, if you're wanting to get through it quickly in 10 hours, you can. But if you want to slow it down, if you want to try and learn, if you want to think through the questions and give it a go, you'll pause it and it'll add time. Other things, I also talk very quickly, so you can also slow it down if you would like to hear me speak at a more reasonable rate. And I do suggest people to watch the videos, and then as part of your revision right towards the end of the exam, you can listen or watch them again, whatever is your preference as a form of last minute study. I know I always like listening to content because it does help me to absorb information while I'm doing the boring things like driving or cleaning. So that is the end of the recording. Goodbye to everyone who is seeing this after the fact. I hope I'll see you next time so that you get to enjoy the bonus question as well. See you later. Oh God, I don't even know where the button is to stop the recording.